I never thought I would become the kind of woman who could destroy a man's entire world with nothing more than a smile and a carefully orchestrated plan. But here I am standing at the edge of everything I once believed in, watching it all burn down around the man who thought he could break me without consequence. My name is Alina Ashford, and I am 52 years old. And until 6 months ago, I was the invisible woman behind one of the most successful real estate developers in the entire state of Georgia. My husband, Marcus Ashford, built an empire on my ideas, my connections, and my family's money, while I stood in the shadows, applauding his every move like the dutiful wife I had been trained to be for 30 long years. But that was before I discovered the truth, and the truth, as they say, has a way of setting you free, even when freedom feels like falling off a cliff into complete darkness. Let me take you back to the beginning, because every revenge story needs context, and mine begins on what should have been the happiest day of our lives in recent memory, the day our twin sons David and Daniel graduated from medical school at Emory University, was supposed to be a celebration of everything we had worked toward as a family. I had spent months planning the perfect graduation party at our estate in Buckhead, coordinating caterers and florists and musicians. Because Marcus insisted that nothing less than perfection would do for his heirs, the irony of that word heirs would become painfully clear soon. Enough the morning of the graduation, I woke early to oversee the final preparations, and Marcus was already gone from our bed, which wasn't unusual since he often left before dawn for what he called business meetings. I had stopped questioning these early departures years ago, because trust was supposed to be the foundation of marriage, and I had built my entire life on that crumbling foundation. The graduation ceremony was beautiful, and I sat in the audience watching my sons in their caps and gowns, feeling that surge of pride that only a mother can truly understand. David caught my eye and smiled that crooked smile he had inherited from my father, and Daniel gave me a subtle thumbs up. And in that moment, I felt like every sacrifice I had made over the past 3 decades had been worth it. Marcus sat beside me, but his phone kept buzzing in his pocket, and he kept checking it with increasing urgency. When I asked if everything was all right, he simply said, "Business never stops, Alina," and I accepted that explanation because I had been accepting his explanations for 30 years. The party that evening was spectacular, if I do say so myself. Our estate was transformed into an elegant garden celebration, with twinkling lights strung through the ancient oak trees, and a string quartet playing softly near the fountain. 300 guests filled our grounds, including senators and business leaders, and society figures who had helped Marcus build his reputation as a titan of Atlanta real estate. I moved through the crowd, playing my role perfectly, because I had become an expert at performing the part of the devoted wife. My designer gown and perfectly styled hair and practiced smile concealed the exhaustion that had settled into my bones over decades of putting everyone else's needs before my own. The champagne toast was scheduled for 8 o'clock, and I had asked Marcus to say a few words about our sons before we raised our glasses to their future. He agreed readily enough, and I noticed nothing unusual his demeanor as the guests gathered around the main terrace, but something felt different that night, and I couldn't quite identify what it was until Marcus clinked his glass, and the crowd fell silent. "My beautiful wife Alina has organized this magnificent celebration," he began, and I smiled at the acknowledgement because public praise from Marcus was rare, and our sons have made us incredibly proud by becoming doctors, following in a tradition of excellence that the Ashford name demands. He paused, noticed his hand trembling slightly as he held his champagne flute. "But tonight I must make an announcement that has been long overdue." My heart should have started racing at those words. But instead I felt a strange calm settle over me, as if some part of me had always known this moment was coming. "I have spent 30 years building an empire and a family and a reputation," he continued. "But I have not been honest with any of you." The murmur that rippled through the crowd was like a wave building before it crashes against the shore. "Leaner," he said, turning to face me directly, "I have been having an affair for the past 15 years, and I am in love with someone else." The silence that followed was absolute, and I could feel 300 pairs of eyes turning toward me, waiting for my reaction, waiting for the tears, or the screaming, or the dramatic collapse that society expected from a wronged wife. But I did none of those things. Instead, I reached into my evening bag and pulled out a slim envelope that I had been carrying with me for the past 3 months, waiting for exactly this moment. "I know," I said, and my voice was steady as I handed him the envelope. "What you don't know, Marcus, is that I have known for much longer than you could possibly imagine, and I have been preparing for this moment with the same meticulous attention to detail that I once devoted to supporting your career." His face went pale as he opened the envelope, and I watched his expression transform from confusion to disbelief to absolute terror as he read. Documents inside. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as Marcus's confident demeanor crumbled before their eyes, and I allowed myself a small moment of satisfaction before continuing, please. Everyone, I said, addressing our guests, this celebration is for my sons, and I will not allow it to be overshadowed by personal matters. There will be time enough for the truth to come out. Enjoy the rest of the evening, David. And Daniel stood frozen near the fountain, their faces reflecting shock and confusion, and I went to them. Immediately placing a hand on each of their arms, this is not your burden to carry tonight, I told them softly. We will talk as a family tomorrow. But right now you have earned this celebration. Marcus was still staring at the documents in his hand, and I could see his mistress Victoria Chen hovering at the edge of the crowd, her face a mask of barely concealed panic. She was 38 years old, and she was one of Marcus's senior vice presidents, and she had been sleeping with my husband since before my sons started high school. I had discovered the affair 3 years ago when I found a receipt for a piece of jewelry I had never received. And that discovery had led me down a rabbit hole of investigation that revealed the full extent of Marcus's betrayal. But I had not confronted him then, because I understood something that most wronged spouses do not realize in the heat of their initial pain. Immediate confrontation gives power to the betrayer, while patient preparation gives power to the betrayed. So I had spent 3 years quietly building my case and understanding our financial situation, and consulting with attorneys and forensic accountants, and even a private investigator named Samuel Cross, who had become something of an unlikely ally in my quest for justice. What Marcus did not know was that the empire he had built was not really his at all. The initial capital that launched Ashford Development came from my family's trust, and the connections that opened doors for him came from my father's network, and the creative vision that distinguished his projects came from my suggestions whispered to him in private and claimed by him in public. I had been the architect of his success in more ways than one, and now I was going to be the architect of his downfall. The documents in that envelope were just the beginning, and they contained evidence of financial improprieties that went far beyond adultery. Marcus had been systematically embezzling funds from our family trust and using company resources for personal expenses, and engaging in tax fraud that would make federal prosecutors very interested in his business practices. I had discovered all of this through careful investigation, and I had documented everything with the help of professionals who knew how to build airtight cases. But the most devastating revelation was yet to come, and it was the one that would truly destroy everything Marcus had worked to build. The party continued in a subdued fashion after my brief speech, moved through the remaining guests with practiced grace, accepting their whispered condolences and curious glances with dignity. Marcus had disappeared inside with Victoria, and I could only imagine the frantic conversation they were having. I found my sons sitting together on the stone bench near my rose garden, and their faces showed a mixture of anger and concern and confusion that broke my heart. Mom, Daniel said as I approached, "How long have you known?" "Long enough," I replied, sitting between them and taking each of their hands. "This is not how I wanted you to find out, but your father chose to make this public, and I had to protect myself." David's jaw tightened in that way that reminded me so much of his father. "What were those documents? You gave him the beginning of the end," I said simply. "Your father has made some very poor decisions, and not just regarding his personal life. There are financial matters that will need to be addressed." Daniel, who had always been the more analytical of my twins, leaned forward. "What kind of financial matters?" I took a deep breath before answering. "For the past several years, your father has been misusing funds from the family trust, the trust that was established by your grandfather to protect our family's wealth. He has also been using company resources in ways that are not legal, and he has been hiding assets that should have been disclosed in our tax filings." The weight of my words settled over my sons like a heavy blanket, and I could see them processing the implications of what I was telling them. This was not just about an affair anymore. This was about criminal activity that could result in prison time and the complete destruction of the Ashford name. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" David asked, and there was hurt in his voice that I understood completely. "Because I needed to be certain," I explained, "and because I needed time to ensure that you and your brother would be protected regardless of what happens to your father. The trust that your grandfather established has provisions that I have been working the attorneys to enforce. Your inheritance is secured in ways that your father cannot touch. But his company, his reputation, everything he has built, is now at risk because of his own actions." The irony was not lost on me that Marcus had chosen this night to reveal his affair, thinking he was taking control of the narrative, thinking he was going to blindside me with his announcement and walk away with his mistress into some new life he had imagined. Instead, he had walked directly into the trap I had spent 3 years constructing, and now there was no escape. Over the next few weeks, the full extent of Marcus's downfall became clear. The documents I had given him that night were just a preview, and the real damage came when the SEC and the IRS and the FBI all received anonymous tips about irregularities in Ashford Development's financial records. I had nothing to do with those tips, of course, at least nothing, that could ever be proven, but Samuel Cross had contacts everywhere and sometimes. Justice needs a little help finding its way. Marcus tried desperately to contain the damage, but the investigation revealed a web of corruption that extended far beyond what even I had discovered. He had been bribing city officials to secure development contracts, and he had been defrauding investors in several of his projects, and he had been maintaining a shadow accounting system that hid millions of dollars in unreported income. The news coverage was relentless, and Marcus Ashford went from being respected pillar of the Atlanta business community, to being a symbol of corporate greed and corruption overnight. Victoria Chen, who had thought she was going to become the next Mrs. Ashford, quickly distanced herself from the scandal. And I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had taken a job in New York and wanted nothing more to do with Marcus or the mess he had created. I filed for divorce 3 days after the graduation party, and my attorney, Margaret Sullivan, was a shark in designer clothing who had been preparing for this battle for months. The prenuptial agreement Marcus had insisted upon when we married actually worked in my favor, because it had been written when my family had far more assets than Marcus could claim, and it included provisions that he had clearly never read carefully. A fidelity clause protected my interests in the event of infidelity, and a financial fraud clause allowed for immediate separation of assets if either party engaged in deceptive financial practices. Marcus had violated both clauses so thoroughly that his own attorney advised him to settle rather than fight. Meanwhile, I began the process of reclaiming my identity. And this was perhaps the most challenging part of my journey. I had spent 30 years being Mrs. Marcus Ashford. And before that, I had been Alina Whitfield, the daughter of real estate developer Robert Whitfield. And I had never really been just Alina, the woman who had her own dreams and ambitions and desires, had been buried so deep that I wasn't sure she still existed, but she did exist, and she was stronger than I ever imagined. My father had taught me everything he knew about real estate before he passed away, and I had absorbed his lessons, even as I channeled them through Marcus for decades. Now, I began to apply that knowledge directly, and I discovered that the connections I had maintained over the years were actually my connections, not just extensions of my husband's network. I started with a small project, just a boutique hotel renovation Midtown, that no one expected the disgraced wife of Marcus Ashford to take on successfully, but I poured everything I had into that project. And I brought it in under budget and ahead of schedule. And the reviews were stellar. Suddenly, people were talking about Alina Ashford, not as the victim of a cheating husband, but as a surprisingly talented developer in her own right. The irony was delicious. My sons were my greatest supporters during this transition, and their belief in me gave me strength when I doubted myself. David had started his residency in pediatric surgery, and Daniel was pursuing oncology, and both of them made time to visit me regularly and remind me that I was more than the sum of my failed marriage. They also made the difficult decision to limit their relationship with their father. And this was not something I had asked them to do. Marcus had shown his true character through his actions, and they drew their own conclusions about what kind of man he really was. 6 months after the graduation party, Marcus was indicted on multiple counts of fraud and tax evasion and corruption, and the trial was set to begin the following spring. His attorneys had been unable to negotiate a favorable plea deal because the evidence against him was overwhelming, and his former business partners were lining up to testify in exchange for immunity. I attended the first day of the trial not out of spite, but because I needed to see this chapter of my life come to a close. Marcus sat at the defendant's table looking smaller than I remembered, and the confidence that had once defined him was completely gone. He turned and saw me in the gallery. And for a moment, something passed between us that might have been regret, or might have been understanding, or might have been nothing at all. The prosecution laid out their case methodically, and the evidence was damning. And I listened to testimony that revealed layers of deception I hadn't even known about. Marcus had been lying not just to me, but to everyone, and the web of fraud he had constructed was so elaborate that it seemed almost impressive in its complexity. If it hadn't been so morally bankrupt, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. And as the judge pronounced the sentence, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. This man had been my partner for 3 decades and the father of my children. And now he was being led away in handcuffs to face the consequences of his choices. I did not gloat or celebrate, because that would have diminished me, and I was no longer willing to let Marcus Ashford have any power over who I was or how I behaved. Instead, I walked out of that courtroom and into the bright Atlanta sunshine, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt free, but freedom, as I was learning, was not just the absence of Marcus, it was the presence of possibility. and I was just beginning to explore what that meant for me. The years that followed were transformative, and I built something that was entirely my own. Ashford is not the name I kept for my company, because I refused to let go of what I had helped create. But the company I built was nothing like Marcus's operation. Was I focused on sustainable development and affordable housing and community revitalization? And my projects won awards and attracted attention from investors who appreciated doing well by doing good. My sons married wonderful partners and gave me grandchildren who called me Jiggy and looked me with the same pure love that I had once seen in their father's eyes before everything went wrong. Family dinners at my new home, a beautiful townhouse in Virginia Highland, were filled with laughter and warmth. And I discovered that this was what happiness actually felt like. I also discovered that I was not too old for romance. And this was perhaps the most surprising development of all. Samuel Cross, the private investigator who had helped me build my case against Marcus, had become a friend. Years and somewhere along the way, friendship had turned into something more. He was nothing like Marcus. He was quiet where Marcus was loud, and humble where Marcus was arrogant. And he had spent his career uncovering truth rather than constructing lies. We took things slowly because neither of us was in a hurry, and that slowness allowed us to build something solid and real. It was Samuel who encouraged me to write my story down not for publication, but for my granddaughters who would someday face their own challenges and would need to know that women can be strong and strategic and successful on their own terms. The revenge I achieved against Marcus was not just about punishment. Although justice was certainly served, it was about reclamation. And it was about taking back every piece of myself that I had given away over 30 years of marriage, and proving that it was never too late to become who you were meant to be. Marcus served 8 years of his 12-year sentence and was released early for good behavior. I heard through Daniel, who maintained minimal contact with his father, that Marcus was living in a small apartment in Florida, working as a consultant for a construction company, and trying to rebuild some semblance of a life. He never remarried, and Victoria Chen had moved on years ago, and he was essentially alone with the consequences of his choices. I did not feel sorry for him, because sympathy would have been a betrayal of the woman I had become, but I also did not waste energy hating him. Indifference, I discovered, was the ultimate form of moving on. My company, Whitfield Development, named for my father, grew to become one of the most respected firms in the Southeast. And I mentored young women who reminded me of myself and taught them the lessons I had learned about value and worth, and never accepting less than they deserved. The graduation party, where Marcus thought he was going to humiliate me, became legendary in Atlanta society. But not for the reasons he intended. It became a story about a woman who refused to be broken, and who turned her darkest moment into the launching pad for her greatest success. And that envelope, that slim cream colored envelope that I handed Marcus on the terrace, contained not just documents, but a message that he would carry with me for the rest of his life. The message was simple: you underestimated me, and that was your greatest mistake. Now let me tell you about the second act of my revenge, because destroying Marcus financially and legally was only part of story. The deeper revenge was living well, and I pursued that revenge with the same meticulous attention to detail that I had applied to building my case against him. The first year after the divorce was the hardest, because I had to learn who I was without the identity of wife and partner, and I had to face the loneliness that came from dismantling a life I had known for 3 decades. There were nights when I sat in my new townhouse, surrounded by boxes I hadn't unpacked, and wondered if I had made the right choices. But then I would think about Victoria Chen and the 15 years of lies and the financial crimes that could have destroyed my son's inheritance. And I would remember why I had done what I did. I started therapy, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to understand how I had allowed myself to disappear into someone else's life for so long. Dr. Miriam Washington became my guide through the archaeological dig of my own psyche. And together we excavated the beliefs and patterns that had led to accept less than I deserved. She helped me see that my desire to support Marcus had come from a good place, but that somewhere along the way support had become subjugation and partnership had become invisibility. We also explored my family history and the expectations that had been placed on me as a Whitfield daughter in a society that valued women primarily for their ability to enhance their husband's success. My mother, Alina Sr., had been a society hostess whose entire identity was wrapped up in my father's achievements, and I had unconsciously followed her example even as I told myself I was different. The difference I realized was that I had the resources and the education and the opportunity to break the pattern, and that breaking was exactly what I was doing. One year after the divorce, I took my first solo vacation, a 2-week trip to Italy that I had always wanted to take, but that Marcus had always dismissed as impractical. I wandered through Rome and Florence and Venice with a journal in my hand, and I wrote down observations and thoughts and dreams that I had never allowed myself to acknowledge. I realized that I loved architecture, not just as a business tool, but as an art form, and I began to incorporate more creative elements into my development projects. I also realized that I had neglected friendships for years because Marcus demanded so much of my attention, and I began to rebuild connections with women I had known before my marriage. Charlotte Winston, who had been my roommate at Georgia Tech, and Margaret Sullivan, my attorney, became regular companions for dinners and shows and long conversations about life and love and second chances. They introduced me to other women who had gone through similar experiences, and I discovered a sisterhood of survivors who understood what it meant to rebuild from the ashes of a destroyed marriage. We started meeting monthly for what we called Phoenix dinners, and we shared resources and contacts and emotional support, and we celebrated each other's victories with genuine joy. These women became my chosen family, and they taught me that asking for help was not weakness, but wisdom. My relationship with my sons deepened in unexpected ways after the divorce. David, who had always been more like me in temperament, became my confidant, and we talked about everything from his challenging cases at the hospital to my ongoing development projects. Daniel, who had Marcus's charisma, but my ethics, became the family connector, and he insisted on regular gatherings that kept us all close. Both of them told me years later that watching me survive and then thrive had taught them more about resilience than any lesson they had learned in medical school. I was particularly proud when David married Jessica, a surgeon he had met during residency, who was exactly the kind of strong, independent woman I wished I had been at her age. At their wedding, I gave a toast that brought tears to many eyes, including my own. I told them that marriage was not about one person disappearing into another, but about two complete people choosing to walk side by side. And I told them that the moment they started keeping secrets or tolerating disrespect was the moment they needed to course correct, because small compromises can become catastrophic surrenders over time. Jessica hugged me afterwards and thanked me for being the kind of mother in law who told hard truths with love. And I knew then that the lessons of my experience were being passed down in positive ways. Daniel married Rosa, a brilliant oncologist from a large Cuban American family, and their wedding was a joyous celebration that combined Southern tradition with Latin passion. Rosa's mother, Carmelita, became one of my dearest friends, and we bonded over our shared experiences of supporting our families through difficult times. She had lost her husband to cancer years ago, and she understood both the grief of loss and the freedom that comes afterwards. We would sit on my patio drinking wine and comparing notes on grandchildren, and she taught me to make authentic Cuban food, while I taught her the secrets of Southern hospitality. My grandchildren arrived in rapid succession, and David and Jessica's daughter Alina, the third, was born just 2 years after their wedding, and Daniel and Rosa followed with twins Carlos and Maria, a year later becoming a grandmother, transformed me in ways I hadn't anticipated, and I discovered reserves of patience and playfulness that I didn't know I possessed. I also discovered that I wanted to leave a legacy for these children that was about more than money. I wanted to leave them a model of what it meant to live with integrity and courage and purpose. So I began to document my story. And this very narration is part of that documentation. I want my granddaughters to know that their grandmother was not always the confident, successful woman they see today. I want them to know that I spent decades feeling invisible and unimportant, and that I made mistakes and accepted treatment I should never have tolerated. I want them to know that it is possible to start over at any age, and that the skills and knowledge you develop while helping others can become the foundation for helping yourself. Most importantly, I want them to know that revenge at its best is not about destroying someone else, but about reclaiming yourself. The third year after the divorce brought unexpected challenges that tested my resilience in new ways. My development company had grown rapidly, and I was facing the growing pains that come with success. I had to hire staff and delegate responsibilities and trust other people with work that I had previously controlled. And this was difficult for someone who had learned through bitter experience that trust could be betrayed. I made mistakes during this period, and I hired people who weren't right for the company. And I took on projects that stretched our capacity too thin, and I nearly burned out trying to prove that I could do everything myself. But I also learned from these mistakes, and I developed systems and boundaries that allowed the company to grow sustainably. The turning point came when I hired Catherine Morgan as my chief operating officer. Catherine was 20 years younger than me, and she had the business school credentials that I lacked. And for a while, I felt threatened by her competence, but she taught me that delegating was not the same as losing control, and that building a team was actually a sign of strength, not weakness. Together, we created a company culture that valued transparency and ethical behavior, and we developed a reputation for fair dealing. that attracted both investors and employees. The projects we took on became increasingly ambitious, and I found myself returning to some of the ideas I had whispered to Marcus years ago, but now implementing them under my own name. We developed a mixed use community in Southwest Atlanta that combined affordable housing with retail space and community gardens, and it won awards and attracted national attention. We renovated historic buildings in small Georgia towns that had been overlooked by larger developers, and we brought economic opportunity to communities that needed it most, and we created a foundation that provided scholarships for women pursuing careers in real estate and construction. And I personally mentored the first class of recipients. The media eventually became interested in my story, and I gave interviews that focused not on Marcus's crimes, but on my own journey of reinvention. I was careful to present a narrative of empowerment rather than victimhood, and I never spoke publicly about the specifics of my revenge, because I wanted people to focus on what I had built rather than what I had destroyed. But privately, I savored every milestone, and I knew that every success was also a reminder to Marcus of what he had lost. Marcus himself became a footnote to my story rather than a defining character, and the last time I saw him was at Daniel and Rose's wedding, where he appeared briefly and quietly, and left before the reception. I nodded to him across the room in acknowledgement of the decades we had shared and the children we had raised. And then I returned my attention to the celebration at hand. He looked old and diminished, and I felt nothing but neutral observation. The man who had once dominated my life was now just another guest at the edge of my peripheral vision. The most profound revenge I discovered was not about making Marcus suffer, but about making myself flourish. Every morning, I woke up in my beautiful home and went to work at a company I had built and came home to a life I had chosen. And that daily living was the ultimate refutation of everything Marcus had believed about me. He had thought I was nothing without him, and I had proved him wrong in the most comprehensive way possible. I was not just something without him, I was everything I had always been capable of being, if only I had believed in myself sooner. My relationship with Samuel deepened over the years, and we eventually married in a small ceremony on my patio. Surrounded by our children and grandchildren and closest friends, he was 60 and I was 58, and we had both lived enough life to know what we wanted. And what we didn't, we maintained separate finances and separate spaces within our shared home, because independence had become precious to us both. But we also created a partnership that was unlike anything either of us had experienced before. Samuel understood my need for control, because he had seen how the loss of control had nearly destroyed me, and I understood his need for quiet because his work had exposed him to the loud chaos of other people's crises. We were two wounded people who had healed enough to be healthy together, and that was perhaps the greatest gift of my second act. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if Marcus had not made his announcement at that graduation party, and if he had continued his deception. Indefinitely, would I have ever found the courage to leave? Would I have lived out my days in a comfortable prison of my own making, never knowing that I was capable of so much more? The answer, I think, is that some part of me always knew, and that part was just waiting for the catalyst that would force me into action. Marcus's public humiliation attempt was that catalyst, and I am grateful for it. In a strange way, he intended to break me, but instead he freed me, and that freedom became the foundation for everything that followed. My company is now worth more than Marcus's company ever was at its peak, and I have created wealth that will support my family for generations. But more importantly, I have created a model of what women can achieve when they refuse to accept limitation, and I have trained dozens of young professionals who will carry that model forward into the future. When I speak at conferences and business schools, I always emphasize that my story is not unique and that there are countless women like me who have supported their partner's success while neglecting their own potential. I tell them that it is never too late to start, and that the skills they have developed in service to others are valuable, and that they deserve to be the protagonists of their own lives rather than supporting characters in someone else's narrative. The revenge continues every day in small ways that only I truly appreciate. When I see my name in a headline, or accept an award, or close a major deal, I think about Marcus sitting in his Florida apartment watching his former wife succeed beyond anything he ever achieved, and I smile not because I want him to suffer, but because I know that my success must remind him constantly of what he threw away. That reminder is more punishing than any prison sentence, because it can never be escaped. My granddaughter Alina the third, who is now 7 years old, recently asked me why Grandpa Marcus doesn't come to family dinners, and I told her that some people make choices that take them away from the people they love, and that Grandpa Marcus made those kinds of choices. I told her that we can love people even when they're not around, and that we can also be happy without them. She seemed to accept this explanation with the wisdom that children sometimes display, and she returned to playing with her cousins without further questions. But I know that someday she will want to know more, and I will tell her my story, and I will tell her that her grandmother was once a woman who didn't believe in herself and let other people define her worth, and I will tell her that everything changed when I decided to write my own story. Instead of letting someone else write it for me, the final piece of my revenge came last year. When I was invited to speak at the graduation ceremony at Emory University, the same university where my sons had graduated, and where Marcus had made his infamous announcement, I stood at the podium looking out at hundreds of graduates and their families, and I thought about how different my life would have been if I had finished my own degree. Instead of dropping out to support Marcus's career, I told the graduates that education is valuable, but that real learning continues throughout life, and that it is never too late to become who you want to be. I told them about failure and resilience, and the power of refusing to accept someone else's definition of your worth. I told them that the people who underestimate them will eventually regret it, and I told them to remember that moment when they were tempted to give up because that moment was almost always followed by breakthrough. If they just kept going, when I finished speaking, the audience rose to their feet in applause, and I saw my sons and their families in the front row and Samuel beside them. And I felt the kind of success that has nothing to do with money or status. It was the success of having lived through something terrible and come out stronger on the other side, and being able to share that journey in a way that might help others avoid some of pain I had experienced that evening. We had dinner at the same restaurant where Marcus had made his announcement all those years ago, and I had reserved the same private room, and I had invited the same core group of friends who had witnessed his betrayal. But this time the celebration was real, and the toasts were genuine, and the love in that room was palpable. I stood and raised my glass, and I said that I had learned something important about revenge, and that the best revenge was not about destruction, but about construction, not about tearing down the person who hurt you, but about building up yourself to heights they never imagined you could reach. I said that I had spent 30 years supporting someone else's dreams, and that the last 10 years had been about pursuing my own, and that I was finally living the life I was meant to live. And then I said something that surprised even me. I said that I was grateful to Marcus for breaking my heart, because broken hearts heal stronger than unbroken ones, and my heart had healed into something beautiful and resilient and capable of more love than I had ever known. The room was silent for a moment. And then my daughter in law, Jessica, raised her glass and said to Alina and to all of us who are still learning from her. And the applause that followed was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. As I write these final words, I am sitting on my patio, overlooking the garden. I designed myself with roses and hydrangeas and a fountain that reminds me of the one at my childhood home. Samuel is inside making dinner because he is a surprisingly good cook, and I can hear my grandchildren laughing in the background. Because they are visiting for the weekend, the evening light is golden, and the air smells like jasmine, and I am content in a way that once seemed impossible. I think about Alina Whitfield, the young woman who fell in love with a charismatic man named Marcus, and who gave up her own aspirations to support his dreams, and I want to tell her that it will be okay, and that the pain she will experience will eventually become the fire that forges her into something stronger. I think about Mrs. Marcus, Ashford, the invisible wife who spent 30 years in the shadows, and I want to tell her that she was never actually invisible, and that she was learning and growing and preparing for the day when she would finally step into her own light. And I think about Alina Ashford, the woman I am today, and I want to tell her that she still has so much living left to do, and so many more stories to write, and that the best chapter of her life might not have been written, yet my revenge against Marcus was complete the moment I stopped caring about him and started caring about myself. It was complete when I built a company that employed hundreds of people and created value in communities that needed investment. It was complete when I found love again with a man who sees me clearly and loves me for exactly who I am. It was complete when I became the kind of grandmother whose stories will be told for generations, and it was complete when I finally understood that I had always had everything I needed inside of me, and that all I had to do was stop giving it away to someone who didn't deserve it. If you're reading this, and you see yourself in my story, then please hear me when I say that your time is not over, and that your best days may still be ahead of you, and that the people who underestimate you are giving you a tremendous gift. The gift is their underestimation itself, because it means they will not see you coming when you finally decide to rise. And when you do rise, and you will rise, make sure you rise so high that you can't even see the people who tried to keep you down. That is the ultimate revenge. And it is the only kind worth pursuing. My name is Alina Ashford, and I am 62 years old, and I have learned that the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. And I have been through fire that I thought would destroy me, but instead it made me unbreakable. Every morning I wake up and I choose myself. And every night I go to sleep knowing that I have lived that day with integrity and purpose and love, and Marcus, wherever he is, knows that the woman he tried to humiliate at that graduation party has become someone he could never have imagined. And that knowledge is the revenge that keeps on giving long after the courts have rendered their verdicts. And the prison sentences have been served. The revenge is in my success. And the revenge is in my happiness. And the revenge is in the simple fact that I am living a life that he can never touch or take from me ever again. And that, my friends, is how a woman who once thought she was nothing became everything she was always meant to be, and proved that it is never too late to write your own story and become the hero of your own life. Because the best revenge is not served cold, but served living and thriving and becoming more brilliant with every passing day, while the person who tried to destroy you watches from a distance, unable to stop your rise or diminish your light. And if I can do it after 30 years of invisibility, and 3 years of careful planning, and 10 years of rebuilding, then so can you, because the power was always inside you, waiting for the moment when you would finally believe in yourself enough to use it. And that moment can be today or tomorrow or any day you choose. Because the only person who gets to decide when your story changes is you. And don't ever let anyone else tell you otherwise, because your story is yours to write, and your revenge is yours to define, and your life is yours to live on your own terms, and no one, not a cheating spouse, not a skeptical society, not your own doubting heart, can take that from you unless you let them. So don't let them, and instead rise up and build something beautiful from the ashes of whatever has tried to burn you down, because the ashes are just fertilizer for the garden you are about to grow, and that garden will be magnificent. And everyone who ever underestimated you will watch in amazement as you bloom, and that blooming is the revenge that matters, and that blooming is what I wish for you, and that blooming is what my story is really about in the end. Not about Marcus and his lies and his crimes and his downfall, but about me and my truth and my courage and my rise. And that rise continues every single day in ways large and small. And it will continue until my last breath, because I have finally learned that I am enough, and I have always been enough, and no one can ever make me feel less than enough again. And that knowledge is the greatest revenge of all, and it is available to anyone who is willing to claim it. So claim it, and rise and become and bloom and live and love and thrive, because that is what we were all meant to do, and it is never ever too late to start.